Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, also its website kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. Anything you'd like to know about what we talked today, you can probably find out more about it there. So, I'm joined today by our recurring guest host, Karl Peterjohn. So, Karl, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Bob. It's wonderful being here.
Well, thanks. I'd like to start off talking about some federal issues a little bit. With a tie-in to Wichita, a week or two, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was an editorial, an op-ed in the Wichita Eagle by Davis Merritt, who's former editor of the paper, and it's called Cabinet 451. He tied it into Ray Bradbury's futuristic novel Fahrenheit 451, where everything gets turned around, where it's the job of firemen to burn books, not to put out fires. And he says, meet Cabinet 451. President-elect Donald Trump is recruiting his band of federal firefighters who will be anxious to burn away government regulations without regard for the content. He makes the accusation, they say government is the enemy and so forth, like that. Now, as an example, he talks about the nominee for Secretary of Labor, who is an advocate of replacing workers with machine. Karl, I did a little bit of research and found out that we've been replacing workers with machines for a long time. In 1800,
it's called the Industrial Revolution.
Well, yeah. In 1800, 74% of the American labor force worked in agriculture, some as slaves, actually quite a few as slaves. By the year 2000, 2.4%. Yet we have more food, better food. We spend much less of our income on food. That seems like progress to me.
I think it's absolutely progress. The idea that we have the Kansas state statutes, if I took the books that consist of the statutes, this would basically, my arms are probably barely wide enough to cover them all. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, I had a friend of mine who's an attorney bring me the law books of Kansas from about 100 years ago. And he brought me a book that was about so wide. It was about, it was a large book, and it was about the size of an unabridged dictionary. So it was not a small book, but it wasn't like an Encyclopedia Britannica, if anyone remembers how big those used to be.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times when people talk about technology and jobs, they're thinking about computers, but really agriculture, what revolutionized that? Well, it was the steel plow, for one thing. Then it was the gasoline and diesel motors and some advances in science of how to hybridize corn and things like that. So it wasn't really computers. They probably have a role today, but at least not 100 years ago. They didn't have a role in the great productivity advances we've seen in agriculture.
Well, the Green Revolution occurred 50, 60 years ago with better genetics and better seeds. But I'd go back to the McCormick and the reapers, as well as, you mentioned steel plows, but that was only a tiny part of the industrialization or the capitalization, use of capital. There's a wonderful story, Bob, about Milton Friedman visiting India. And he's at a construction site, and there are all these laborers, just literally thousands of workers with their shovels and wheelbarrows. And Friedman goes up to the Indian in charge, and they're visiting to discussing this project. It was a big public works type project, a dam or something. And Friedman said, "Hey, why don't you bring in equipment? You could do this so much faster." And the Indian official in charge looked and said, "No, Mr. Friedman, you don't understand. We have lots and lots of people, and this is a jobs program for us. And so if we had bulldozers and heavy construction equipment, what would these people be doing?" And Friedman said, well, if that's indeed the case, that it's a jobs program, why don't you take away their shovels and give each one of them a spoon?
Now, I heard that. These stories are sometimes kind of apocryphal. I heard it was in China, and they were using machines and so forth. And Friedman said, well, if you really want to create jobs, give them spoons instead of shovels and machines and things like that.
But the real question is then how much productivity do you have from each worker? And that's really the key, Bob, because when you mentioned the percentage of people who are working in agriculture, in terms of the volume of output per farmer, it has dramatically increased. And that's true in almost every other area except government.
Well, we don't really want them to be more productive sometimes, but so here's Davis Merritt.
Well, no, as a former county official, yes, we do. Sedgwick County, for instance, we operated 911 and the emergency medical system, and we've expanded it because we've had increased call volume, but trying to do it effectively and efficiently is a challenge.
Efficient government gave us laws that went from this to this, in other words, too.
Well, I didn't say it was efficient, though. I said that's what happened.
Productive. Carl, we need to take a moment off for a commercial break. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. With me this week, Karl Peterjohn. So, Karl, I don't know if you've had a little time to watch some of the confirmation hearings going on this week, but, these things are really almost a joke. They're oftentimes very contentious. They're oftentimes showboating by the senators. I heard Al Franken, the Minnesota senator, they have a
Saturday Night Live veteran, too, by the way.
5 or 7 minutes what it was, and he went on a big spiel. Finally, he asked a question. The chairman said, Mr. Franken, your time is up. So he didn't even get the nominee, whoever it was, to answer a question. But and these questions are oftentimes designed to trip up appointees. You could have Albert Einstein sitting there, and if they'd ask him about questions about physics, that would probably trip him up. So I don't know, are these confirmation hearings do we really learn much from them, Karl?
Well, sadly, I think this week's hearings have been very unproductive. In the past, sometimes they do. But I think the lesson we can learn from the hearings, Bob, in 2008, there were 7 of then President-elect Obama's appointments who were confirmed the first day he became president on January 20th, 2009. Yes.
And that's not going to happen for this. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's often important for people to keep a close eye in terms of if the situations were reversed, because the Republicans today were in the same position that the Democrat majority was in 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. And you had a minority of the opposition party basically playing a role, and they went out of their way to confirm President Obama's appointments very quickly, and it appears that that's not going to occur.
Yeah, although in the last year they decided not to hold hearings on a Supreme Court nominee. One of the things that's going on is that we may remember a couple of years ago, Harry Reid, who was the Senate majority leader at that time, he implemented what we now call the nuclear option or the nuclear rule or something like that, which really led to the elimination of the filibuster. It used to be that really, to get anything moved through the Senate, you'd have to have a majority of 60 senators. Now it's only 50, and there are 52 Republicans. This is a real illustration of, I think, just the genius of Walter Williams, the economist, who said the type of rules we should have are what we'd want if our worst enemy was in charge. And I think that Senate Republicans are learning that right now. I think President Obama is learning that right now because he did so much through the executive order, and Donald Trump, with the stroke of his pen, can undo a lot, at least, of what President Obama did.
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting, and of course we're filming this the day before the transition in the presidency occurs, but I would watch for the first 4 days in terms of executive orders that come out.
I think they said they're going to take the weekend off to party, so it might be not till Monday till they actually do some things. But I heard there's like 200 they've got lined up or something. Now, some of these are so minor. They're almost the equivalent of renaming a bridge or a post office. Those types of things, I don't think, not really big impact on public policy. But some of these are going to be big.
Well, the immigration area and anything that relates to the Obamacare, I think, are going to be huge, Bob. There's no ifs, ands, or buts in terms of the size and scope. When you have the federal government taking over 1/6 of the economy, which is what happened with the Obamacare revolution, in a sense, you're going to see real changes. And when the Obamacare failures could not be handled legislatively, and you changed it by executive order, or the president did so, it means that it can all be undone with a stroke of a pen.
And the problem I think Republicans are finding is that some parts of Obamacare were popular, like kids staying on till age 26, but also community rating, which means when you sign up for insurance, and I do buy my own insurance, they ask age, where you live, and if you use tobacco products. Those are the only questions that go into determining a rate for your insurance. There's no health history or anything like that other than age and whether you use tobacco.
It's going to be interesting to see in the states that have now legalized or expanded the legal use of marijuana to see how that will all transpire and play into it, Bob.
I don't think it's going to be able to be asked about that. But so I think that definitely in favor of repealing Obamacare, but coming up with a replacement, I think the Republicans are going to have to be real careful. And it's something that's going to take a couple of years, whatever they decide to do. So like I say, keep your eyes tuned. Let's take a moment off for a commercial break. And there are some local issues in Kansas we ought to be talking about too. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn. So here locally, you know, the legislature's in session. It's been almost 2 weeks, I guess they've gone through, and Dave Traubert of the Kansas Policy Institute, that we know, wrote a letter that was in the Wall Street Journal about a week ago talking about a cautionary tale from Kansas. Now, most people in Kansas say our budget's a mess. The Brownback's tax cuts have been a total failure. I think it's true that the Kansas economy has not been growing very well. Whether it's the fault of the tax cuts or not, I think that's a huge leap to make. But basically, Dave Traubert says, you know, we needed to cut spending to match lower revenue. And KPI's been saying that, I have too, ever since the tax cuts 4 years ago when they came in effect. But people don't want to cut spending, do they? Do you think by the time we're through this year, do you think Kansas general funding spending for the new year will be more or less than for this previous year?
No, it will be more.
Undoubtedly, I think.
It's
probably
not
even on an inflation-adjusted basis.
It's not even close, although there is a game that gets played in Topeka sometime, and I used to call it the pump and dump. Mm-hmm. You'd pump up the previous year's budget, and you'd dump the percentage growth between the next year's budget versus last year's budget that you just pumped up. Mm-hmm. And you can say, okay, well, the growth in the budget for the proposed budget that I've proposed to the legislature is only, this happened throughout the 1990s, it's only like 1.4%. It's a very, very tight budget. But they've just done a supplemental appropriation into the existing budget because the budget year starts July 1 for 2000. We've been in the 2017 state fiscal
Almost
year
since over.
Well, it's a little over, a little more than half over. And so what you do is you pump up the existing budget, and then you have a small percentage increase. Mm-hmm. And this was how, especially with the liberal news media coverage, the reporters were totally uninterested in terms of looking at a bigger picture of, you know, going more than just a year at a time. And they just run with well, it's only growing like 1.4% or some very modest nominal amount.
I thought you were going to say that the trick that they do is they ask for a budget increase of this much, they get this much, and they say, oh, look how much we cut the budget, but actually spending probably increased even more than it was before.
That occurs also, but I think it was a little bit more, that's true at all levels of government. And the challenge that, viewing it as a former elected official, Bob, we've really struggled to try and make clear, you know, how much of the spending growth had been tied, whether it was increased demand for services, like, for instance, the volume of calls we'd get at 911, or, you know, frankly, it's support, you know, the Sedgwick County would have their own, electric and water bills too.
Right. We hear over and over again about how schools have just been decimated, that class sizes are rising. I had to ask for the employment and enrollment figures for the most recent school year, the one we're about halfway through right now. And believe it or not, the number of teachers rose, and also the number of certified employees rose. Those are things like librarians and nurses and things like that. And the ratios of pupils to those employees also fell. So there's more employees for a smaller number of students, so to speak. Now, they talk about class size, and the Kansas Department of Education, as far as I can tell, does not release class size statistics, only pupil-to-teacher ratios. But you have to ask yourself, if the pupil-teacher ratio is improving, but class sizes are getting bigger at the same time, what's going on?
Well, there's an old joke about figures never lie, but liars. What you go out from there in terms of playing games with the numbers. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many teachers I've talked to who've been very frustrated, Bob, when they hear that you'd say, well, according to the data, if you take 460,000, I think is the total number of students in the state of Kansas, mm-hmm. and by the number of employees who are certified, I think a number like 35,000. And then you do need to pull out the other certified professionals like the nurses and librarians and those folks to try and get a more reasonable number. But you've got special ed to consider, and then you've got other specialized categories too. I thought it was interesting from looking at the national data, one of the states that has a relatively strong public school structure and has fairly high test scores, Utah is one of the states that has a very high number of pupils per teacher.
Yeah, Kansas really actually has a pretty low pupil-teacher ratio amongst the states. I calculated that this week too. You can see that at wichitaliberty.org.
It's a great chart, Bob.
Yeah, I don't know what people are talking about from time to time. So, Karl, we've run through another segment. Let's take another moment off from Wichita Liberty TV, and we'll finish up this week's show. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, again with co-host Karl Peterjohn. So, government just does not want to cut spending. Legislators don't want to cut spending. I remember a couple of years ago, there's a legislator and a member of House of Representatives from this area who's hawkish on spending. That's what he says. But when there were some proposed spending cuts, someone told him how much the schools in his district would be losing in funding. And he said, I could not support that. And every legislator is going to say that. So how do we ever cut spending if everybody says, my district can't afford those cuts?
Well, for many years before I became a county commissioner, I was an advocate for taxpayers at the State House.
Kansas
Taxpayers Network. And a lot of people said, when I talked with legislators, I tried to emphasize that what you needed was a pro-growth policy to try and grow revenue, mm-hmm. and then try and improve the state's fiscal climate by limiting your spending growth to half the revenue growth. Mm-hmm. And the problem that Kansas has had, with ag prices going down, with energy prices going down, with the boot heel of Washington on the neck of the aviation industry, particularly corporate jets here in Wichita, we've had a difficult economic environment the last few years,
and
Bob.
These are a couple things that are unique to Kansas apart from the country as a whole. I mean, we've all suffered under President Obama, I would say, but suffered equally, I would think.
Well, some states have done better than others. I would cite Texas, that has no state income tax, as an example. And we've been in a situation where if you can limit your spending growth, and this is one of the things we tried to do at Sedgwick County, where we lowered the mill levy slightly. County spending was higher when I left the county commission than when I took office, but we've been able to basically hold the spending growth at a level that was less than the growth, even though we had very, very modest basic economic growth in the tax base during the 8 years I was on the commission. And that was what I recommended to legislators. If you can limit the spending growth to basically half of what natural growth that you can promote. And if you can do some things that are very pro-growth, so you expand it, that gives you a bigger pie to cut up. The problem that exists is there are very powerful spending lobbies, and they're put out all sorts of bogus information. I find the road contractors to be particularly egregious, although obviously education by far is the biggest, but the State Highway Fund, which of course is off budget, and that makes it even trickier, Bob,
well,
to deal with.
They all have very persuasive arguments. For example, the education lobby, they just want more spending. I mean, without rhyme or reason, they want more spending, and they trot out the children. It's for the children. Who can be against the children? I mean, it's if you say, hey, let's pull back on spending or let's allow school choice, then you're immediately branded as anti-children. And you're right, they do simply just lie to us sometimes as well.
Well, I thought one of the more egregious lines that I heard was that Kansas had the fourth largest number of roads of any state in the entire country. And actually, if you looked at the data, if you looked at interstate, U.S. highway, state highway miles, Kansas is relatively modest number. But if you start counting unpaved dirt township roads, you can expand the number significantly. And because Kansas, being a relatively flat state and operating in the township model that goes back to New England, does have a lot of unpaved dirt roads. Here in Sedgwick County, there were a lot more dirt roads here in Sedgwick County in terms of road miles than there were of the 600 miles in the county road system or the 1,500 road miles in the city of Wichita.
And we are a pretty big state geographically. I mean, not near the biggest, but not a small one either. So, the highway spending too, they talk about robbing money from the highway fund, and there is a point there, but not the point that we should spend more on highways. What we should not do is what we've done, which is to have the highway department issue long-term bonds and then transfer that money to current spending.
Well, we've done a lot of borrowing and basically putting a mortgage on the future for it. I would throw out two things. There was an interesting study, I believe, by the Reason Foundation that showed that Kansas highways were like the third best in the entire country. But the second thing that I would throw out is Kansas is maybe the only state where general sales tax revenue is transferred over to the highway fund. Normally, the highway funds are strictly funded by dedicated fuel and like driver's license fees and similar dedicated revenue source, not general. Normally, sales taxes are general fund, and Kansas is one exception to that.
And another very bad thing we did was 2 years ago we borrowed $1 billion and gave it to capers. And all the legislators, including Republicans and the governors, say, oh, we really improved the financial position of capers. But if you had a consolidated balance sheet for the entire state, nothing at all changed, except a different group has to pay, and we've just assumed a lot of risk, because if we do not earn more than the interest we pay on those bonds, then we just go further and further behind. So it's people ask me sometimes why I'm depressed, and I think these are some of the reasons why. So anyway, Karl, we're out of time again, so I appreciate you stopping by to give us some insight based upon your experience in government, and before that as a lobbyist, if I do say the dreaded word. So,
well, advocate for taxpayers.
That's good, advocate for taxpayers. So thanks a lot for watching. We'll be back again next week on Wichita Liberty TV.